As I promised, I will make video on Queen's Gambit. Here it is. White starts with pawn to d4, black responds similarly with pawn to d5, white then pushes pawn to c4, and black captures the pawn on c4, accepting the gambit. This move immediately challenges white to prove their compensation for the sacrificed pawn. White has several strong continuations here, but the most common is to develop the knight to f3, reinforcing control over the e5 square and preparing to recapture the pawn on c4. Another popular move is pushing pawn to e3, aiming to recover the pawn with the bishop on c4 without compromising the center. After developing the knight to f3, black often responds by developing the knight to f6, attacking the e4 square. White typically continues by pushing pawn to e3, preparing to recapture the pawn on c4 with the bishop. Black has several options here, such as pushing pawn to e6, solidifying the center, or pushing pawn to c5, trying to undermine white's central control. If black pushes pawn to e6, white proceeds by capturing the pawn on c4 with the bishop, regaining the pawn and setting up for a strong center and quick development. Now white can develop pieces actively, aiming to leverage their lead in development. For example, after black pushes pawn to c5, white castles kingside, ready to put pressure on black's queenside, especially on the c-file. Switching gears to the Queen's Gambit declined, the main line begins with white advancing pawn to d4, black responding similarly with pawn to d5, white then pushes pawn to c4, and black pushes pawn to e6. Here, black refuses to capture the pawn on c4, opting instead to maintain a solid pawn structure. White's usual follow-up is to develop the knight to c3 or knight to f3, both moves developing pieces and preparing to reclaim the center. After developing the knight to c3, the most common response from black is to develop the knight to f6, increasing control over the e4 square. White then continues by developing the bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6 and putting pressure on black's center. Black can respond by developing the bishop to e7, breaking the pin and preparing to castle. White typically follows up by pushing pawn to e3, supporting the pawn on d4, and opening lines for the bishop on f1. Black then castles kingside, securing the king. After white develops the knight to f3, both sides have completed their initial development, and the real fight for the center begins. Another critical setup for black in the Queen's Gambit declined is the Cambridge Springs defense. The moves are: white advances pawn to d4, black responds similarly with pawn to d5, white pushes pawn to c4, black pushes pawn to e6, white develops the knight to c3, black develops the knight to f6, white develops the knight to f3, black pushes pawn to c6, white develops the bishop to g5, black develops the knight to d7, and white pushes pawn to e3, followed by black moving the queen to a5. In this variation, black aims to create immediate pressure on the knight on c3 and potentially win a pawn. However, this setup requires careful handling as white has numerous tactical opportunities. Okay, let's end this video here, but if you want similar explanation on Italian chess opening, then click here. Goodbye.